Perfect. All right. So if I look up a lot, that's just because like the other screen's over there. But basically, this education is going to go through four essential stages. The lens of our view based on the background of intervention in the wider Middle East, and background and the recent events in Syria specifically, as well as how the anti-war movement in Britain failed and what we can do next about it. So at the end, there's going to be hopefully a quick discussion. So these are the questions for that. Feel free to think on it now, just so you're better prepared at the end. Um, but there you go. Um, so essentially, the Syrian civil war was a part of the Arab Spring, which began in 2011. Whether this began as an organic uprising against stagnant political rule, it's often a thing that's perpetuated in the media, basically, that position. But this is not a vital matter for communists in the imperial core. We know that the era of independent bourgeois revolutions is long over. Revolutions led by capital nowadays adopt imperialist interests. While it's true, Al-Assad, Gaddafi, and Ben Ali from across the Middle East and North Africa, they ruled for generations, but they did adopt internal transformations. This sort of came in Syria from the transformation of a state-only led economy under Hafez al-Assad to one with neoliberal characteristics under Bashar al-Assad. Um, the vast majority of violent disagreements, however, were either created by or quickly invited the intervention of the United States to fulfill America's interest in dominating the resources of the region, not because of a lack of change in the region. Um, the US and the UK obviously need to manufacture consent for their interventions. I'm going to run through two quick examples of where this happened in the Middle East. But at the end of these examples, I'm going to put forward a question of where you guys think, or know actually, of where the US and the UK, MI6 and CIA, across the world, not just in the Middle East, have manufactured lies to win consent for war abroad. So if we can get more examples, that'd be great. So my two examples, firstly, comes from Iran's Mossadegh. Iran's Mossadegh was the president in the 1950s. He wanted to nationalize British petroleum. This was because essentially British Petroleum were extracting oil that was Iran's oil and sending it abroad to Britain. He wanted that resource that is produced in Iran for Iranians. For this, the CIA and the MI6 worked together to buy off corrupt military officials to execute a coup. But in order to first do the coup, they needed to create a phenomenon of mass hysteria and violent disorder on the streets. And in order to do this, they bought out mobsters and gangsters in Iran to essentially go out to the streets, pretend to be demonstrators, um, and essentially create this fear of like public disorder. When this happened, they actually advised Mossadegh to send the police and the military to crush these demonstrators that they themselves had created. And when Mossadegh did this, with the military on the streets, violent disorder in the streets as well, this is when the military executed the coup and made it seem very legitimate that Mossadegh was unfit to rule. But then, about 30 years later in the 1980s, CIA and MI6 documents come out that they actually manufactured the state of chaos. Another example is I forgot her name, uh, Nayara's witness testimony. This was done to the US Capitol building where the Senate and the House sit, and it was done at the United Nations. You can see on the left here, it was first published in 1990 by the New York Times. And essentially, she was stating that she saw the Iraqi army in Kuwait pull babies out of incubators and essentially killing newborn children. This was used as a part of sort of humanitarian concern for Western intervention. So then the Gulf War begins. It devastates Iraq. It devastates Kuwait, which is an incredibly oil-rich region. But then 2 years later, on the right, the same New York Times newspaper company says there is deception on Capitol Hill, and that actually Nayara was the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the US. Therefore, it's very unlikely that she saw this because she would have been in the US. And on top of that, she works for a PR company called Free Kuwait from Iraq, which its entire purpose is to draw the US into war with Iraq. So those are my two examples. Can anyone else think of other examples, not just in the Middle East, but across the world, where our governments have manufactured lies in order to go to war? Feel free to raise that. Yeah, Nick.
Maybe in Vietnam, the Gulf of Tonkin.
Yeah, could you expand on that a bit?
I think it was like a fabrication of some military confrontation between the Navy, which the US used to um, up its invasion.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's a great example. Um, as far as I know, a couple of years later, after the Vietnam War, they admitted it was all made up. It was crickets. But yeah, Sam.
I guess the coverage of Libya and Gaddafi prior to NATO intervention in Libya, well, sorry, NATO like war on Libya. In terms of that, I think Gaddafi was always portrayed like Gaddafi was always labeled as like a dictator who had no support and was very corrupt, and so they could portray it as like the liberation of Libya rather than just them wanting to bomb Libya because it didn't suit their interest and like overthrow Gaddafi.
Yeah, that's another great example and really relevant to what we're here about. If I remember right as well, when people in Tripoli, in Libya's capital, went out to demonstrate in favor of Gaddafi, the United States took because they control the airspace, took the opportunity to essentially bomb the demonstrators. I don't think they actually hit the demonstration itself, but they hit the surrounding areas, and therefore like you said, it makes it seem like he's a very unloved person when people were willing to come out in their millions to support him. Um, but yeah, any other examples that people can think of? Well, those are two great examples already. Yeah. Yeah, Caleb.
The colour revolution in Ukraine, where it was sort of the accusations of snipers of the Ukrainian police force, was it the Berkut, and sort of saying that the pro-Russian government was killing its own people, which later turned out to be people from right sector, I think it was, or at least I think that's what came out of the investigation lately. So yeah, sort of the use of that to foment the color revolution within Ukraine lately.
Yeah, that's another great example. Guys have definitely done your research. But yeah, no, this is all great, guys. Thank you. But yeah, basically this shows to us um that we can't always trust the Western media narrative when it comes to their word or the justifications for their interventions. Um, Therefore, most people in Britain are confronted with the choice of having to analyze the Arab Spring and other Western interventions with either a lens of abstract democratic tasks like free Syria, free Libya, etc., with little analysis of the movements in the ground and the background of the historical involvement of the powers in the region, which is essentially a position that requires them to absolve Western states of their past interventions, making it seem like it's a clean slate. They've never lied to us before. Or they can look at it through a lens of anti-imperialism, which is what we put forward. This position puts into historical context the interventions of the West, their resource and ideological interests, and with an understanding of the power dynamics at play on a global scale, with a view that the West, because of their past interventions, are not actually innocent, and that interventions from the West is often attached with statements which are not genuine or sincere, or are complete fabrications in order to manufacture consent to intervention. And also demonstrate this, we can see here that there are very little countries with sovereignty in the Middle East. The United States absolutely dominates the region. And this is something that, with an anti-imperialist lens, we approach with an understanding of. Apologies, my script's just gone. But yeah, now we'll go into the background of the Syrian uprising itself. The Arab Spring, which was a protest movement, as I mentioned before, across the Middle East and North Africa region, quickly fell into the control of US imperialist interests. This was most apparent, and Sam brought this up already, when the US and UK, alongside the rest of NATO, began direct military intervention into Libya in 2011. And this was as an extension of Blair's idea of the doctrine of the international community. Even though he wasn't in power anymore, it was a continuation of this. This was a concept that previously pushed for direct UK intervention into Kosovo and Serbia, as well as Iraq in the early to mid 2000s, under the pretense that states can intervene in other countries regarding any action they consider an abstract idea of humanitarian concerns. So if the UK and US essentially just think that a country is breaching humanitarian law under an abstract idea, you don't have to really point to any sort of specific law or follow the United Nations. They can militarily intervene. In Libya, this intervention meant that the opposition won, and Libya went from one of the most developed countries in the region with free housing, free university, to a failed state ever since. There's a lot of instances of reported of slavery coming back to Libya, as well as a civil war between two warlords and ISIS, essentially. And when it comes to Syria, while most of the Syrian opposition were initially just army mutineers who either acted out of self-interest or had some legitimate disagreements with the state, the US under Operation Timber Sycamore, and the UK with the Conflict Stability and Security Fund, or the CSSF, began sending military equipment and funds to the opposition forces. This quickly took over any legitimate opposition that existed in Syria for the benefit of the West. And this was done immediately at the outbreak of the Syrian civil war. Turkey, as well as an occupying force in northern Syria, has essentially acted as a middleman between NATO and Syrian opposition forces, by directly giving the Syrian opposition NATO military weapons or giving them military advice with their military generals. This is also like an article that shows that the US and the UK were sending funds to Islamic extremists in the Syrian civil war, who, they vetted, but like these were still people who were saying they were carrying out a jihad and would work with Al-Qaeda. As well, HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, received indirect benefit from the UK and US from the operations that I mentioned before. HTS took over as the majority of opposition forces in Syria. They are a rebrand of Al-Qaeda. Sometimes it is viewed in Western media that they are a split, and this is what's often perpetuated. But their name change, as it says in this article, was blessed by the Al-Qaeda leadership, who viewed it as a tactical move, as HTS had grown large enough to function independently and to make HTS seem more of a homegrown Syrian organization so that they can develop alliances with other Syrian opposition forces. That is why their name literally translates to liberation of the Levant, which is the region where Syria is, to make it seem more like a regional force rather than having any affiliation with Al-Qaeda that's based in Afghanistan. In either case, no matter what, they still espouse the same radical jihadist ideology as Al-Qaeda in comparison to the secular Ba'athist government that formerly controlled Syria. That is who they were fighting against. So the recent developments, last month, HTS launched a new operation called Deterrence of Aggression. This operation had direct Ukrainian involvement, as confirmed by the Ukrainian military themselves, who say that they sent 150 military drones to Syria in order to aid this operation. Benjamin Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel, also released a speech that took credit for the success of the operation as they were bombing Syrian and Hezbollah weapon depots during the HDF offensive and prevented the arrival of Iranian military aid to Syria. This entire scenario would have been impossible without the knowledge or effort of the United States, given their close cooperation with the Israeli and Ukrainian military. Therefore, this could be said to have been a coordinated effort of the United States through their proxies to defeat Assad and install what they knew was a jihadist organization to the Syrian government. Reportedly, Iran did ask Bashar al-Assad if he needed military aid. Bashar declined and said there was no willpower in his army to fight. So, faced with a tired army on one side and a war on multiple fronts on the other side, HTS was able to blitz through Syria while Assad had no choice but to flee to Russia. As you can see as well, because of HTS's like radical jihadist ideology, former ISIS fighters have found a very happy home in the HTS, and there was a lot of footage around that time. One in our Challenge magazine where ISIS fighters were freely walking around Syria thanks to the protection of HTS. Yeah, Sam?
Yeah, sorry, could I just ask a quick question?
Yeah, it was.
Like I feel so ignorant saying this, but what is the big difference between ISIS and Al Qaeda? Because I know they're obviously different groups, but I don't really know the difference.
Yeah, like ISIS believe in this idea of like a perpetual jihad. That's essentially like declare war on everybody. So even though they started off in Iraq, they quickly went to war in Syria and they quickly tried to go to war with Turkey. And essentially their idea is like radical expansion no matter what. Whereas the Al Qaeda one is more like an idea that you can take over a country at a time. This is still the idea of like, um this global religious sort of order, but they believe it starts regionally and then you unite and you take over more and more. So they view it as more like a tactical step. They also have like some disagreements when it came to sort of Al Qaeda believed it was against their religion to execute hostages. They still took hostages, but they believed it was against their religion, against Islam to execute them. Whereas ISIS were more than happy to start executing them. So they had like some disagreements in tactics and also like how to conduct warfare religiously. But yeah, does that answer?
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And you said that ISIS were based from Iraq as well,
Yeah, that's where they began.
right? Okay, thanks. That clears that up. Cheers.
Yeah, as well, also it's important to note, I guess this kind of comes in later, but HTS as leader, current leader, was actually the ISIS top commander in Syria. So it started in Iraq, they took over most of Iraq. Once they started going to Syria, they actually got this guy who would later become the leader of what is now the dominant force in Syria. But yeah, we'll get to that in a sec. But what's next? Syria under Assad was definitely not a utopia, but this is undoubtedly a massive blow to anti-imperialist efforts in the region. The HTS government has already dismantled the headquarters of Palestinian resistance organizations, such as the PFLP, DFLP, and PFLP-GC, who were all based in Damascus. The future of our communist sister organizations as well in the region is unclear, as they were members of the Assad government and will now have to negotiate their presence with a new government. There's essentially two Syrian Communist parties, and while one of them is open for negotiations, the other isn't. And even with the one that's open for negotiations, we don't know what's going to happen. Allegedly, HTS has started coming into skirmishes with Palestinian resistance organizations on the border with Lebanon. And the HTS leader has stated that Syria will never be a base to attack Israel in response to Israel bombing Syria. Their Minister for Commerce has also declared that all state-owned enterprises will be privatized. Undoubtedly, this is going to be sold to US markets. By exploiting ethnic and religious divisions for the interests of their expansion, numerous ethnic and religious groups are now under the threat of slaughter. While Syria is 80% Sunni Arab, there's 20% that isn't. There are diverse religious backgrounds from Christians to different Islamic sects, to Kurds, Assyrians, Armenians. And there are already reports that sort of massacres are already being taking place based on these ethnic and religious divisions. And the Syrian opposition figure, such as the current HTS leader, Abu Mohammed al-Julani, is interviewed, as you can see, by CNN and hailed in The Guardian as a moderate, tolerant Islamist, while the UK and US terror list still has his name in their list for his leading role in ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Syria. I believe the United States took him down today, but the fact that there was a 10 million reward for him, the fact that he was on that list to this day, kind of goes to show this guy was complicit in culpable evil in the region, even according to their own backers. Turkish-backed forces are also with the intent of genocide encircling the majority Kurdish northeastern Syria, which itself is already a proxy for US oil interests in the region. Yugur jihadist militias have reportedly declared their next target is China, with their base of operations in the new Syria. And essentially, in short, Syria has become a paradise base for the many arms of US imperialism, much like how NATO, Israel, and Ukraine coordinated together to win Syria. Now Syria will join the fold to attack Iran, Russia, and China's sovereignty as they try and forge an independent line from the United States. But yeah, before we head on, is there any questions? Okay, that's good. That must mean I'm doing a good job. But yeah, now we'll get on to how the anti-war movement failed in Syria. The Greens, SWP, and AWL, socialists, so-called socialist parties who take part in the anti-war movement, called this operation a success. Their words identical to that from Keir Starmer and Netanyahu. This idea that Assad is a tyrant, his defeat is a success, were cautious about the Islamists. This is the same position which lost us in Libya. The leadership of Stop the War coalition had claimed that the rebellion in Libya was a popular rising and Gaddafi the head of a brutal dictatorship. The national officer of Stop the War coalition, John Rees, would state that nobody's going to shed a tear for the fall of this brutal dictator, meaning Gaddafi. This same position meant that when the UK began funding the Syrian opposition, we heard essentially crickets from the anti-war movement. Because Assad is a tyrant, Assad is a dictator. The anti-war movement perpetuated the manufacture of lies that led to the consent for this intervention. While anti-war demonstrations led by Stop the War Coalition did exist, their analysis to the public eye was lacking anti-imperialist strategy. We cannot turn to the public and say Assad and Gaddafi are tyrannical dictators. Then when rebels wielding US weapons appear outside the capital of those countries, turn to the public in the same voice and declare the overthrow of those who we call tyrants is actually a bad thing. That's why, while demonstrations existed, they were very low in numbers. We weren't able to convince the public that this was actually a bad thing. This means we cannot enter with a lens of neither Washington nor Libya, Syria, or Iran. This is a stance of indifference that acts as though the aggressor can be either of those countries. But we know this isn't the case. The aggressor, which this position inadvertently lends support towards, is the major power, the United States. Our task, especially in the global north, should be based around the stance of our ruling class. This is where our organization, as the Young Communist League of Britain, makes an impact in our country, not Syria, Iran, or Libya. Recognition of that leads to a difference in our strategy. Recognition of that means we target the UK military establishment rather than feel entitled to comment on the internal politics of countries that our state is actively burning down. It means that people in Britain listen to the anti-war movement. Does that mean that we don't care about the abuse of prisoners and the flaws, the legitimate flaws in these countries? No. It means we recognize that our public stance is a matter of strategy in defeating the warmongering ruling class. We need to focus on dispelling lies created by Western media rather than perpetuating them, especially as they seek to rebrand HTS in Syria and vie for ethnic separatism in China. We need to focus on what our government is doing abroad. If it is critiques of those states that we need, let's not be afraid. Western media has all the fronts on that covered. We need to focus on deconstructing lies, approaching every hit piece on Iran or China with caution and opposition to any military intervention. So that's the end of my part. This is also would be lovely to have a discussion as well. So these are some of the questions I thought could lead the discussion. But is there any questions? Is there anything that people want to sort of make note about their opinions? Has anyone changed their opinions on this?
I was quite happy that you confirmed my opinions.
That's always good.
I thought it was nuts to see that graph, the Bloomberg graph about the level of US military presence in like West Asia, and I thought it kind of demonstrates how unique countries like China, Iran, and Russia are, as like they really are the exception rather than the rule in terms of not having US military bases or military like personnel in them.
Yeah, definitely. Having zero, like that is, yeah. The fact that it's a feat as well is actually incredibly like sad in this world. But
Mm.
um I think yeah, that's gotta be something we've got to focus on the fact that like people like to think that Iran is like this imperialist power in the Middle East, but like Iran goes to countries that invite it to protect it from the United States, who actively, send their troops to countries whether they like it or not.
Yeah, I think one thing that I'd been a little bit confused. I think I was confused for quite a while until September of this year when someone gave me a communist review that had an article on it. I didn't really know I didn't really have much of an informed opinion about Russia and like an analysis of it, of whether it should be described as an imperialist power or not. Because I think I hadn't really thought it through properly in terms of actually thinking like what is imperialism and to like what extent does Russia fit that mold? And the article spelled it out much more clearly, but because there hadn't been anything in like challenge that I'd seen about it, I didn't really know before that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that would be a good article if anyone wants to start doing it. But there's an interview I saw recently that's pretty good in that too. I could send it over. But yeah, once you start to like think, oh shit, these words have actual definitions attached to them, and we should apply it, um, changes your view.
Yeah, it does, and I think sorry, just one more thing. I think I've realised this because my dad bought me for my birthday, got me like a subscription to the Morning Star to come to my house every day. Um, and because of that, I end up reading it most days. And it is weird looking at the Morning Star because there are very conflicting opinions that appear on that regarding Russia and imperialism. Like on one day there'll be something that says, like on one day there'll be something about like a special military operation, like against Nazis in Ukraine, and then the next day there'll be something from someone being like, "Oh, Russia's an imperialist power in Ukraine." And so yeah, it's been. I think that kind of reflects the like the kind of cooperative nature of the Morning Star, but it's also not good that there's a split line. Trade union
Apologies.
the trade union congress in this country is like in favor of like support, like it's against like Israel's genocide in Palestine, but it's like in favor of sending more and more weapons to Ukraine. I think that's right, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess the kind of actually no, I'm not sure. I guess like part of the solution is to make sure you're involved in the trade union movement as a communist.
So definitely like getting more involved, being able to push forward these motions and arguing the communist point of view, um, will be a huge step in terms of getting us there. Um, any other ideas though? I was thinking as well. I think in terms of, oh yeah, Caleb.
Sorry, comrade, didn't mean to cut you off.
No, you go.
I was just going to say, the only thing I can really think of is I know there's quite a bit of sort of one of the contradictions in the union movement is that there's obviously unionized weapons manufacturers, and that sort of tends to, in many instances, prevent even those conversations from taking place of whether they should be supportive or not of that. Um, and so I think it would be, I don't know, quite useful really to sort of hear from the weapons manufacturers themselves, sort of those union voices of their arguments, but also sort of looking back, if you will, try and develop this idea of the Lucas plan, on sort of how the union could be winning um, those sorts of jobs for those workers rather than just sort of being resigned to the fact that they're weapons manufacturers and they will never change. Of course, those skills can be adopted for something a lot more useful, and the union sort of doesn't try and take an active stance in trying to move towards that, and that's something that I think we should look to change. Also, I completely agree on your previous point as well, which is, and obviously can be wrong, and that we should obviously be fighting very much for a revolution in that country as soon as, not sort of just resign to the fact that um, it might be someone else first, but obviously bringing it here as soon as possible time.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, definitely like I agree that definitely would be a big gain if we start doing more educational content around what the anti-imperialist lens against sort of this abstract democratic tasks idea, and just like more about like why we shouldn't be at war with Iran, and the US and UK are kind of lying to you about Iran or China or whatever. And once we have those resources, they I think will become pretty vital in the sense of once you become active in the trade union scene and start talking with trade unionists a lot more, you can send those resources. You know what I mean? You don't have to engage in 5 hours of debate and random sources and whatever. You can sort of send that resource and or compile a list of, multiple educational resources, and it can make the conversation a lot smoother for all parties, and hopefully that makes it more convincing. Um, but yeah, Sam.
Yeah, I very much agree. I think like we said earlier, stuff on Russia, stuff on Iran would be super useful. Just to kind of help people because you can't be an expert on everything. It's really useful to clarify and make positions easy to well, I mean, easier to take. There was one other thing I was going to add in terms of the what we talked about trade unionists and the like and resisting imperialism, war, and stuff like that. Is it's not a trade union, of course, but cooperatives in this country. Um, there obviously some of them are not in the state we'd like them to be in, like the cooperative company itself. So obviously I don't think it's exactly in the state that we want it to be in, but in the future and with engagement, something like that could like and cooperatives generally in this country could be a useful like way to resist UK imperialism to halt UK and US imperialism as well. Like for something like the cooperative shop, like if there was better engagement with that, and because that its political, like its ideological position changed and was controlled by people who by anti-imperialists, then things like the BDS movement could be like institutionalized within that cooperative, just as like a hypothetical example beyond trade unions as well.
Yeah, definitely. As well, like um, Nationwide, which acts as like a cooperative uh bank, and is like one of the, and it's like called the Major Six or something, but it's like the only out of the Major Six, a cooperative bank, and they um yeah, divested from arms sales completely, and it's consistently voted for. So I think, yeah, like you said, we can go even further than that actually if people
Mm.
become more involved.
Oh, that's great. I didn't even know that. I didn't know I bank with Nationwide. I didn't even realize they were a cooperative.
Nice. Yeah,
Check that
everyone
out.
is here going Nationwide.
Yeah, I thought they were. I knew they were a building society, but I didn't realize they were a cooperative as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So
Oh.
um I think that's definitely one avenue that we can like approach it. Cooperative, and cooperative, like you mentioned, like as a whole, they have so many sectors where we can get involved. Um,
Mm.
but yeah, it's gone into 8 p.m. So I'm gonna end it there. But I hope everyone's learned something. If not, I hope everyone's found it sort of enriching of like their sense. Um, but yeah,
Yeah, that's been so. It's been really excellent. Thank you, comrade.
thank you, comrade.
Thanks for your efforts, comrade. Good
Thank you,
evening.
comrade.
Thank you, comrades. All right. Good night, everyone.
Good
Night.
night.
Good night. Bye.